the current president of the Owasco Watershed Lake Association, and Paul Teresi's on as well, the president of the Skaneateles Lake Association. This is kind of a joint public forum. As we've just been joking back and forth and chit-chatting, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Neil Murphy as our speaker tonight. Neil, I'll let you synopsize your illustrious career in a moment, but we much appreciate you taking time to talk with us. I believe you're going to speak about your experience, yours and Joanne's experience on a crop farm that you own. There's riparian buffers with vegetative buffers. And then also, Neil, you're going to talk, I think, about hydrodynamic cavitation oxidation as a way to wrestle with cyanobacteria.
Absolutely.
So, everyone, if you can, record your questions for Neil, maybe in that chat box that's down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or just make note of it on a piece of paper so you don't forget, as I likely would. And we'll do our best to get everybody's questions answered. So without further ado, Dr. Murphy, please.
Dana, thank you very much. You know, my career really started with my dad. My father received his PhD in organic chemistry and his undergraduate degree in chemistry from Holy Cross and Clark University. And so my laboratory was always the kitchen table. Whether it be the first photovoltaic cell driving a 5-watt light bulb, it was always on our kitchen table. And as a result of that, when I was thinking about going to school, it had to be in the area of chemistry. And so I did my undergraduate work at St. Michael's College in Vermont. And there was an ulterior motive there because I love to ski. And the idea of skiing Stowe and Mad River and Sugar Bush, that kind of stuff, just also fascinated me. When I got into the academics, I found I wasn't spending as much time skiing as I wished I really could have. I finished up at St. Mike's. I had the pleasure to spend a summer at Clark University as an NSF trainee in the area of radiochemistry. And then I had an opportunity to be a intern at Brookhaven National Laboratory down in Upton, Long Island, part of a team that was looking at the formation of californium-252. And I was part of that team and helping that team. And then I spent a summer at Xerox Corporation dealing with polymers and coacervation of polymers. So that was my undergraduate experience. I was fortunate to get a NASA fellowship to Syracuse University in the chemistry department. And what NASA was interested in that time was a series of compounds called boron hydrides, and they were interested in them as rocket fuels. And so my work was all looking at the energetics of those compounds and to give them some of that basic information that they were looking for. So the thesis was a rather exotic thesis, electron impact and extended Huckel calculations of a series of pentaborane derivatives. And when I was in the process of finalizing my thesis, I realized that there was a notice on the bulletin board in the chemistry department about a local firm called O'Brien and Geer. And they were looking for an individual that would develop an analytical methodology for measuring mercury in fish flesh and in sediments of Onondaga Lake. And I was the first one to take some of those measurements in Onondaga Lake, leading to over $1 billion being spent in the restoration of the lake. When I went to O'Brien and Geer, I got involved with a lot of aquatic investigations, managing the Onondaga Lake monitoring program in Monroe County for Arundecoya Reservoir, a monitoring program in South Boston Harbor, and one of the larger ones was on the Potomac, Anacostia, and Rock Creek in the District of Columbia. And after a while, when the firm started to get into the work of industrial waste treatment and hazardous waste management, they decided that they needed to have a chemist that could understand what thioethers would be and what mercaptans would be, all these other kinds of things that the civil environmental engineers were not familiar with. So at that point in time, they began the process of converting me into a chemical engineer. I was very fortunate to serve as project manager, managing engineer, a vice president, senior vice president, and ultimately as president of the firm and then chairman of the board. And for me, it was an extraordinary experience. People there I still am very close to and I still love. But Ross Whaley at the time was president of ESF. And Dave, you might have met Ross during your tenure as in graduate school at ESF. Wonderful guy, and he was stepping down. And so I submitted my CV and my interest and all that kind of thing. I went through all the on-campus type of interviews, and then I had to go down to Albany to meet with the chancellor. And that was sort of the last meeting in the process. Well, it turns out the chancellor was a guy by the name of Bob King. And Bob King was formerly county executive in Monroe County. And I had represented O'Brien and Gear's services to Monroe County. As I was getting off the elevator, he comes up to me and said, "Neil, I don't believe I'm interviewing you." And I said, "Bob, I don't believe I'm here being interviewed." And that was the start of an extraordinary 20-year career for me after 30 years at O'Brien and Gear. And I frequently say that the thing that I most remember was when the students would refer to me as Big Neil. And they would chant occasionally, "Big Neil, the real deal." And for anybody that's familiar with the Westcott area, I can remember going down to have dinner at Alto Cinco's when there were a group of students and alumni out on a rear deck, and they started chanting "Big Neil, the real deal." And we were talking earlier, Dave, about the students, just extraordinary young people, and it was my privilege to serve them both as president of the college and then for 6 or 7 years as a faculty member. So that's kind of what my professional career was all about. And it led me to have a very, very strong interest in environmental systems. It led me to have the chemist coming out of me have a very strong interest in contaminants of emerging concern, and to have a very strong interest in advanced wastewater treatment systems. So those are the things that really kind of formulated me as an individual and in my professional career. Now that's enough about that. Frank, can we have the first slide? What I want to do in these series of exhibits is to share with you one answer to our HAB issues, and that is reducing the nutrient load in our lakes. And then following that, I'd like to talk to you about some very sophisticated advanced treatment systems that could be used to knock down a bloom in a lake, destabilize the cyanobacteria, and literally oxidize the microcystin LR, which is the most common occurring problematic compound that's produced by toxic compound produced by the cyanobacteria. But starting with nutrient reduction, I really believe we can do an awful lot with what I refer to as common sense best management practices. And simply reducing the sediment load from an agricultural field can make a big difference in terms of the lake and the tributaries that receive that runoff. Because in the case of agricultural chemicals, they're generally very highly bound to particulates. And if you can remove those particulates, you're going to go a long ways to improving the water column chemistry in the lake. Can I have the next exhibit? Frank? Is Frank there? Oh, here it is. This shows an ag field on the left-hand side along basically an access road that has no riparian buffer. On the right-hand side, you can see an ag field that has the start of a good riparian buffer. And there is night and day difference between the stormwater runoff that runs down the ditches on either side, meaning that on the non-riparian buffer side, it is always very, very silty, very opaque, and literally on the riparian buffer side, it has quite a high level of clarity. Next exhibit, please. This just shows the riparian buffer a little closer. It's not a difficult thing. It literally is trying to use some of the local vegetation, encouraging the growth of that vegetation, and they wind up being the filters of that sediment from the ag fields. Next one, please. This shows clean runoff that occurs next to a riparian buffer. It may be hard to see this, but literally this runoff has a high degree of clarity. And those buffers make a big difference in terms of reducing the nutrient load. And what's really important is our agricultural community is losing a very valuable resource with the loss of that fertile agricultural soil. Anything we can do to keep that on the ag field makes their life easier, and it makes all of our lives easier who really appreciate our pristine Finger Lakes. Next slide, please. The other thing I've observed, and this is on Route 41A on the west side of Skaneateles Lake, is some very, very poor road drainage ditch maintenance that occurs. This just shows where the highway department literally had clammed out to improve the flow of runoff from the road and adjacent to the road. But you can see that there's been no attempt to restore the vegetation, no attempt to put in any type of siltation control, fabrics, or anything like that. Now, if we take a look at the next exhibit, this shows also on 41A, a very well done job by the highway department, where you can see in the area of the greatest flow, there's riprap that's put in place. There's vegetation established where the ditch was restored. This is a very important best management practice that we have to educate our highway departments the importance of doing things this way. Frank, next one. This is my wife is over my shoulder here looking at some of these photos. This is an unprotected culvert repair. And this is after the repair was completed, and the actual culvert is at the upper part of this exhibit. And there's been no attempt basically to stabilize the excavated material. And again, this we have to work with our highway departments. Next exhibit. I frequently say, and I think the others on the call also probably say, that basically our forests are our natural filters, particularly in the case of Skaneateles and likely Attisco also. Our hemlock treed forests are some of nature's best filters. And you can see the positive impact of this drainage coming down through a forested area, in that, again, there's a very high degree of clarity of that runoff. They're really doing a great job, and we have to make sure that our forested areas that are in the watersheds for our streams feeding our Finger Lakes are properly maintained, and that they're not excessively cut. Next, yeah. This shows erosion sheet flow across ag land. And it doesn't look that bad here, but it really is. It's carrying an awful lot of sediment, a very significant sediment load. And in this case, this farmer is in many cases contouring with the slope as opposed to being across the slope. The next slide shows the same basic area after the storm event, and you can see the tremendous loss of agricultural fertile soils as a result of that runoff. This requires, again, an education. Most farmers understand that their crops are dependent upon having a very, very good fertile soil system. But this shows very poor practices that could be easily corrected. The next one. Yeah, one of the ways to correct, particularly in the fall and particularly in the early spring, is a reliable cover crop. A winter rye does a very good job and would substantially reduce that type of erosion that we saw on the previous slide after this cover crop was actually planted. Next exhibit, please. Now, sediment control basin is not a big deal. This shows a small sediment control basin, and you can see the overflow pipe from that basin. It is not an expensive thing to do, and it has a great deal of impact. If you'd show the next slide, please. This is literally on the side of our fire lane. And this is an ephemeral stream. It is a tributary that has literally no flow during a dry period, and after a storm event carries quite a bit of flow. Now you can see the large rock on the downside of the sediment controlled structure, this basin. And these were constructed on our fire lane by getting the 8 or 10 individuals who own summer retreats on the fire lane to come together Saturday afternoons and getting in a load of heavy rock, but also a lot of gravel and some filtration fabric to create these sediment control basins. And what we do is, when we restore the surface of the fire lane, the contractor, the excavation contractor that comes in, we have him clam out the accumulated sediment. And I think the next slide just shows another type of sedimentation basin. In this case, we're actually using the culvert, and we've again put some heavy rock on the downside, again to collect the sediment. And again, in the spring, when we bring the contractor in, he'll, with a clam machine, will actually get again the sediment out and put it literally back up on the farm field. Now, I say all the time, we put in probably about easy 4 of these, maybe 5. And the greatest expense we had was the cost of beer on Saturday afternoons. And people felt on our fire lane that they were part of a process of protecting what they felt was so valuable to them. This shows another simplified sediment control basin. And again, here, the ultimate flow is moving down through a vegetated area. Again, a minimal cost, a community effort, and the cost of clamming out the sediment out of these sediment control basins and putting it back up on an ag field, I think might cost each family about $200 a year. That is just wrapped into the cost of restoring the access road, the fire lane. Next one, please. And this shows on the left-hand side, clamming out another sediment control basin. You can see the teeth of the excavator that took it out. And on the right-hand side, you can see where we placed it back up on the ag field, where it continued to perform its function. It carries with it nutrients, it carries with it even some other agricultural chemicals, and it's a value to those that work that soil system. Constructed wetlands, another BMP. We don't have, if we have one constructed wetland on Skinny Atlas watershed, it's probably a lot. But again, constructed wetlands are not expensive to establish, and they can be very, very effective, not only in reducing sediment loads, but reducing the soluble component of phosphorus and nitrogen coming off basically an agricultural field. Very, very effective. It helps to maintain the moisture in the soil systems too. It helps agriculture. It's just a very, very, it helps the ecological system. A very, very good thing to do. Next slide, please. Now, this is the deck of our summer residence on Fire Lane 17. And before we started to do some of that work on those tributaries, this is what my wife and I and our kids would see following a rainstorm event. And we decided we are going to change this picture. And we have the ability to do that. We don't need large grants. We need just the willingness of the community on the fire lane to come together for a couple of hours, maybe on 10 Saturdays, and get some basic stone and get a machine down there to help too. And it can make a big difference. We've also identified a way to make swales in the from the runoff on the fire lanes, so that the runoff goes into a swale about every 25 or 30 feet. And at the end of that swale, because it's on a slope, the end of that swale, we have literally a little dam. And what happens is the water comes into that swale and it acts like a sedimentation basin. And ultimately the water percolates through the soils, and ultimately some of that water evaporates. But the soils are left in place. And again, every year in the spring, the contractor that's restoring and making repairs to the access road mucks out that material, and it goes back up into the ag land. So these are some things that can be done that are not costly. A lake community can do it of themselves. Now, I was lucky that I had some knowledge of what we could do. And a good friend of mine is Scott McClurg, a neighbor of mine, who equally has a good sense of construction, that kind of thing. But all the guys that would get together for these half a dozen Saturday afternoons had a really good time doing something constructive, yucking it up, and having a few beers. Our communities can do this. We just have to show them what really needs to be done and how it can be done. Questions about BMPs?
Yes, Neil. Several were posted during your presentation, and the first I think was put up by Bill Heck. Bill, would you like to speak to your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yep.
can.
Many of these places, especially here in Cuba County, are coming off private, massively huge farm fields of 150, 200 acres with hedgerows that have been removed, swales that have been removed, wetlands that have been removed, minimal buffers, and the best management practices are great. Many of them need to be updated and enforced for today's modern storms. And they need to be field inspected during the storms.
Yep.
To construct wetlands for road ditches would take, you're talking hundreds of acres that would be required. And a mechanism has to be found to require that these existing wetlands and low areas that have been filtering for years can't be removed, or the farmers have to be compensated tax-wise for the removal of potential cropland. Over the past 50 years, I've seen areas that I never thought would be put into farm production in lowlands, and they're just ripping out wetlands and low-lying areas and tiling and just dumping everything and hydraulically overloading these streams. And even the water that's coming off the drain tiles has dissolved nutrients and pesticides in it.
Well, I think, Bill, that's a very much a major problem. There's no question about that. But we have to find a way that we can maintain our precious Finger Lakes at the same time maintain the agricultural community. Now, in the farmland that you saw in these exhibits that I walked through with you, my wife and I had acquired approximately 58 acres of both farmland and wooded areas. And we decided that the farmland had to stay for its intended use, which is in agriculture. And so we leased that out. But when we lease it out, there has to be compliance with what we feel is important and is right. And I have never had the farmers who have leased it complain about our approach to that. Now it's a big difference when you're talking about a couple 100, 500 acre farms. But I think we have to educate the farming community that you put in a hedgerow that serves basically as a riparian buffer. And there are benefits both to the farming community and there are benefits to those that are really focused on the quality of our precious lakes. I have a sneaking suspicion because I took measurements of nutrient concentrations in those sediments that came off the ag land. The farmers are losing significant value on their land. And they're having to make up for it by greater agricultural chemical use year after year. And they're losing some of the very, very valuable topsoil. So I think education's got to be part of it. I agree with you that to the farming community as a whole, if there can be some incentives to the extent that they lose some farmland by putting in a riparian buffer. But I think it's all manageable.
Oh, it all definitely is manageable. A few years ago, I contacted DEC about the farm nutrient management plans, manure management plans. And unfortunately, at least back then, those plans were confidential. Very few farmers would release those. But I then asked the state DEC whether anybody, either the farmer or the DEC, goes into the fields during a storm, or particularly immediately afterwards, to inspect the BMPs. And I was told nobody does. The other thing that could be done very cheaply on a whole watershed basis, and the Owasco Lake Association and Skaneateles could do this. I've suggested it for years, is just go to your county, get the tax maps, and during a storm, drive one or two of those tax maps and with a partner, and look at the road ditches and look at the fields, and just mark on those maps where you're seeing sheet erosion, where you're seeing ditches that are brown, and point discharges of drain tiles. And very quickly, you can pinpoint some of the worst culprits. It's
Bill,
all it is
Bill,
a drive time and a map.
Bill, absolutely.
And you could probably do that without the maps. You probably do that on Google Maps. Or I know I have a program I use when I'm flying or driving around called Tracks on my iPhone, and you can put waypoints in and notations, and you'll pinpoint the source and the exact field that the problems are.
Absolutely. There's some other probably more sophisticated things that could be done too. One that I'm very highly supportive of is precision agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense.
Absolutely amazing.
Yes, and it makes absolutely no sense for a farmer every year to put on the same load of agricultural chemicals without actually knowing what is really needed. And precision agriculture, simply by multispectral scanners on satellites, can give them a really good indication of where they need to add a particular agricultural chemical. And I've been trying to encourage soil and water conservation and others, if we could get a farm in our respective basins to try it and then realize that they can save money by not over applying agricultural chemicals, I think we would have made significant progress.
Yeah, that would be a very good field trip. Partners for a Healthy Watershed, a lot of Cuyahoga County farmers, that would make a great tour to show people what the modern precision agriculture is. It's just amazing, the computer readouts. I was in the farm I used to farm, tractor cab a few years ago. It's self-driving tractor. They had, I think, 4, if not 5 digital monitors, like iPads in it. All I had when I farmed was a Dickie John seed monitor that told us whether we were dropping seeds. And they're getting real-time readouts of down pressure, the seeds, and in harvest time, they're getting real-time readouts of the harvest. And my son's wife could see this all immediately on her cell phone. And then the soil sampling today, in my day, you went out and walked the fields. They have things, they drive over the fields now and collect soil samples in a regular pattern. It's my dreams from the 70s of how to farm have come true.
Yes, it's reality today.
And Neil, this is Dana. We have a couple of the larger farmers in the Cayuga County area on, and I want to give like Greg Raymond a chance to pose a question or two, but
Sure.
I got to jump ahead of you, Greg, and ask Neil, in the riparian buffers that you and your wife planted on the land that you described, how wide are they? Were they? Are you?
Well, they were almost, when we bought the land, they were almost non-existent. Because there was plowing almost right to the edge of the road on the one exhibit I showed on the access road. And we let basically vegetation grow, and we intermixed in the vegetation seedlings of evergreens. And those seedlings of evergreens have now started to fill in, and they create a fairly permanent riparian buffer.
And Neil, are those buffers though on average 5 feet wide or?
Yeah, I would
35 feet
say,
wide, or?
yeah, I would say on the average they're about 5 feet wide. And
And
it does make a difference. You know, I showed the stormwater with just a buffer that's 5 feet wide. You really have a much cleaner stormwater runoff than you do if you don't have them.
Okay, thank you, Neil. And so can you entertain one more
Sure.
question before we let you finish your presentation?
Sure. Yeah.
Greg Raven, Greg, do you want to pose a question to Dr. Murphy or raise a discussion?
Good evening, everyone. Yeah,
Hi.
just wondering, it sounds like you've had some really good results from voluntary work that you do with neighbors and farmers. What are your thoughts on the proposed rules and regulations for Owasco Lake that put the mandatory buffers solely on the farmers' cost, 35-foot buffers? How do you think that's going to play out versus
I think
a voluntary program?
I'll be very honest with you, Greg. I think a 35-foot buffer is crazy. And again, my experience is 5 feet, 6 feet at a max. And we've got the evidence showing that the stormwater coming down, you know, in the culvert area along between that riparian buffer and the road, it really has good clarity. I read about that 35-foot buffer. I just said to myself, Greg, this doesn't make any sense to me.
Thank you. So how do we move past that? How do we increase the water quality of Owasco Lake, or any lake? It doesn't matter what it is. We farm both in Owasco and Cayuga Lake, and to us, it doesn't matter which watershed we're in. We're in a watershed. It doesn't matter where it goes.
Right.
So how can we have buffers all over the place? And I agree that the width doesn't matter.
I think we should take some photos and use the photos to demonstrate what a 5 or 6 foot buffer can do. And I think if we took photos with a 5 or 6 buffer and we took photos with a 35-foot buffer, you wouldn't see any significant difference in the quality of the stormwater.
Yep. So how do you propose we move ahead with the proposed regulations that are at the state level right now, though?
I think I'd have to think about that. But I think a good part of it would be educating our representatives that what we can do with a smaller riparian buffer that makes it a better win-win for both the farming community, the agricultural community, and for the community that is focused on the quality of the lakes.
Yeah, and that's what Partners for a Healthy Watershed has been proposing, is a variable width buffer, wider. If you need a wider one, you have one. If you need a narrower one, you can have a narrower one, but it's not a mandatory 30-foot buffer that's going to take, because we have to pay for the land, pay for the buffer, pay taxes on that land.
Yep.
In most cases, myself, I'm talking from years of experience. 35 feet, just like you're saying, is ridiculous.
It is.
Across the board, and that's what we're having a hard time getting our stance across on that. We don't want to come across as we're not for water quality. We are. That's what farmers are, like you were saying before.
Sure.
About topsoil loss. That's
Yeah.
that's what we make our living off of. So we we can't lose that.
Well, as a follow-up, I'd be glad to try and help if we could get some legislators that would hear our case. That might help also.
That would be great. Thank you.
But, I love the farming community. I relish getting fresh corn right by the side of the road on Route 41A. And as I mentioned, my wife and I own 58 acres, and the bulk of that is leased to a farmer. And he does a great job.
Good.
So Neil, let me propose perhaps you complete your presentation, and then however long you want to spend of your evening with us, we can return to these questions as well as others on the cavitation topic.
Sounds good.
Okay, you're gonna be up all night.
Frank, if we could go, yeah. This is a start of a study and demonstration that OBG Ramble and ESF was involved with, along with Clarkson University. It all started 2 years ago when there was a meeting in Albany, and the governor had asked both myself and Tony Collins from Clarkson, because he was aware, or he was told by DEC that we were working on some technology, to come in and brief him. And so I presented what we were doing, which is this hydrodynamic cavitation and advanced oxidation. And Tony and his faculty presented their system that they're working on, which is electrochemical oxidation. He, at the table, literally an hour after we went through our presentations, said, "I think we've got a competition here." And he said to members of DEC that were there, "What I want you guys to do is I want you to fund their demonstration." He said, "And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the table one of my best bottles of bourbon and the state science prize." And that led to a constructive competition between Clarkson and ESF to take our technology, do pilot work literally in our laboratories, and then scale it up for a system that could be put on a pontoon boat and then demonstrate it in a real life situation on a lake that had an algal bloom. And so what I will be talking about is our piece of that competition. Frank? Hydrodynamic cavitation oxidation sounds pretty complicated, but for those of us that have been involved in having to spec a pump or whatever, you did not want to have cavitation occurring in that pump, because it would literally erode out the interior of the pump casing. Now, why that happens is you produce in that pump, if you've got cavitation, these nano bubbles of air. And when those nano bubbles of air collapse, they create instantaneous pressure differentials at that interface of the collapse of the bubble that could be as high as 500 atmospheres. And they produce temperatures that are up in the range of 1,000 degrees. When those temperatures, extreme temperatures and pressures are created, what happens is compounds called free radicals are created. And for the most part, they're an OH compound, an oxygen and a hydrogen, with an unpaired electron. And those free radicals wind up being very, very strong oxidizing agents. And they can help to degrade basically the cyanobacteria, and they can help oxidize basically the microcysteines that are the toxin that is produced by the algae. Frank, can I have the next one? There are, so what we try to do is synthesize what had happened in those old pumps. And there are 3 ways you can go about producing hydrodynamic cavitation that can be used to oxidize basically cyanobacteria. One is on the left-hand side using a venturi, where you basically have a narrow throat, and as a combination of air in water, supersaturated water with air goes through that, it produces these nano bubbles that then collapse in a bubble cloud. The second is an orifice system, and you can see the bubble cloud being created around the orifice. And where that oxidation occurs and where those free radicals are created are in those bubble clouds as those micro nano bubbles collapse. And then the last is a rotating disc system, which basically just puts more orifices in a compact area, so you theoretically get a larger bubble cloud. Frank? This shows basically a 2-step process where we're using both an orifice as well as a rotating disc system. And this is in basically one of the pilot plant areas we have at the college. And so we were using some of the cultured cyanobacteria as the feedstock to this system to determine basically the ability of this system to render the cyanobacteria neutral and to oxidize the microcystin compounds. Next one, please. Now, that process does a pretty good job, but in reducing the microcystin, which is the real toxin, microcystin is the most toxic chemical that we know of on the face of the earth. I believe I read that in South Africa, they have recorded 1,000 elephants have died from drinking water out of these small ponds and so on that have excessive amounts of cyanobacteria. It is really a problematic agent. So the thought was to go after the microcystin, let's come up with a stronger oxidizing agent. And there is a combination of chemicals called Fenton's reagent that results in more of the hydroxy radicals shown in reddish color on the far right, lower right. And it can produce a higher density of these in the water. So we have been working with Fenton's reagent to augment the hydrodynamic cavitation. Frank? This shows a few of the lab prototypes. On the far left-hand side, that the vertical system is a pilot rotating disc hydrodynamic cavitator. You can, and by the way, I think that's AJ Smith that's looking at it. Some of you I know AJ. And if you go over to the right, you can see just a little bit more of the equipment that we were using to really give this technology a pretty good workover. And then on the far right-hand side, you can see that one of the cyanobacteria cultures that was used basically as part of the feedstock into the system. Frank? Now, all of this led to building a treatment system largely on a pontoon boat. And we borrowed basically Honeywell's pontoon boat that they've used for some maintenance activities on Onondaga Lake. And we outfitted that with basically all the instrumentation, a propane generator, all the pumping systems, the reactive tankage, all of that kind of thing. And we then demonstrated this on Lake Neotawana up in Fulton during every summer has a very strong cyanobacteria outbreak. Now, we never got the bottle of bourbon from the governor, and we never got the science medal from the governor. And when DEC rated basically both systems, Clarkson got 20 points and we at ESF got 19 points. And they were rated on energy consumption, a whole bunch of different variables. But this still has a very strong opportunity to play a major role in breaking down cyanobacteria hotspots or emerging growth areas in our lakes. But I don't mean to put too much on just this technology, but this is technology that we are working with in a fair amount of depth. I also view that nanobubblers, particularly nanobubblers of ozone, have a strong opportunity to also break down microcystin. The Corps of Engineers, I think in Chautauqua Lake, has a system that relies on hydrodynamic cavitation, at least for part of it. And it also represents an alternative. So there's more work being done on this because it is such a risk to communities that rely on these, on lakes like the Finger Lakes as their source of water, as their source of recreation, enjoyment. That definitely is a strong human health risk. So this was all just part of a presentation that I made. I think I walked through these steps in a different way. But so that's what we did. And I think we still have a group of people that want to continue to try and advance not only this technology, but other technologies to come up with a way that we can knock down cyanobacteria blooms before they really get out of control.
So Neil, this is Dana again. I'll jump in with the first question, and this pertains to the advanced technology. Is it mature enough that we could, I guess my question is, this technology would need to be on a mobile platform, pontoon boat, and would need to be quickly moved to where the HAB outbreak is occurring and has just occurred, correct?
That's correct.
It couldn't sit on shore in some fashion.
No, Dana, it could sit on shore. If you have a persistent area where you tend to have an outbreak, and let's say that area is the size of a football field, you could have a shed that had most of the components in the shed, and then have basically a feed system that would go out into that area, possibly even with a submersible pump associated with it, that then would draw basically that contaminated water into that shed area.
And so both of our lakes, I'm thinking Owasco and Skaneateles, do have such pockets, I think, Neil, where, coves, bays, where we perhaps could try this.
Yeah, and again, I think we've had some discussions, Dana. I would start with the simplest type of control possible that would do the job, and then move up to more complex systems. And one of those things that I think our agricultural community, for example, would be familiar with is the use of barley straw and barley straw extract. And so I would start with the less sophisticated systems and see what they can do, and then move into something that might be a little bit more sophisticated.
Oh, okay, thank you, Neil. So everyone, 8 o'clock. Neil, are you able to give us another 10 or 15 minutes if there are remaining questions?
I'll ask my wife.
Yes, he is.
Can I? She said yes.
That's okay. So with her permission, let's see. Anyone want to speak up first? And what other question would you like to ask, either on riparian buffer topic and other BMPs, or on the cavitation technology?
There is a question about oxidizing agents. I saw something on the screen where Fenton's reagent has its drawbacks, and it does. And I think somebody else, it may have been the same person, put down hydrogen peroxide. We actually use hydrogen peroxide coupled with the hydrodynamic cavitation. We only use the Fenton's reagent for laboratory testing. It was never used in the field.
So in the field, we could use hydrogen peroxide, for example.
Yes, in Dana, in the photic zone, the upper foot or foot and a half of the lake water, you have hydrogen peroxide that's actually created by the impact of ultraviolet light on water itself. And so hydrogen peroxide tends to be a chemical that nature produces in water. And so as long as you're not adding excessive amounts of hydrogen peroxide, it would be compatible with the aquatic ecosystem.
Okay, thank you, Neil. I don't want to dominate the Q&A. Anyone else have
Dana,
a question?
this is Paul Teresi. I have a quick question for Neil. Neil, could you just comment briefly on the use of ultrasound in mitigating HABs?
Yes, very good question, Paul. Ultrasound basically reacts with the vacuoles that are on the surface of the cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria is a very cagey organism. It was the first organism on the face of the earth. And it has, for a very simple cell organism, it has become very sophisticated. It uses these cells, air pockets on the surface of the exterior surface of cyanobacteria to either fill with air and rise in the water column, or release that air and sink in the water column. And one of the things that ultrasound does is it causes those vacuoles to collapse. And the net result is a cyanobacteria doesn't have access to the photic zone because it sinks. Therefore, you have no photosynthetic activity. Therefore, in the long haul, it dies.
So how practical are those systems that are available now on large lakes like Owasco and Skaneateles?
I think it would be difficult for a whole lake type of application. But again, if you had a hotspot that had a couple hundred square feet, I think you could use ultrasound fairly effectively. The problem that I see with just using ultrasound is you still have the issue with the microcystin. Because the ultrasound may, over a long period of time, aid in some of the breakdown of the microcystin, but it would be over a long period of time. So I would suggest that an oxidizing agent together with ultrasound might be the best combination.
Thank you.
Yep.
This is Julie, and I'm kind of going to the other end of the spectrum here. Historically, does anybody, I'm not sure how you even go about this, have any expert estimates of how much topsoil has been lost in the Finger Lakes region over the last century or two? Is there any way of knowing?
I don't know. I don't think we've taken any significant measurements that would suggest, we know what some of the factors are that can promote more loss and factors that can reduce loss, but I don't think we have any good measurements of what the loss of topsoil has been over a year or over a decade or whatever.
Thank you.
Ed had a question. I keep seeing it show up very on the screen.
Ed Weinberg?
Yeah.
Yes, so I had a bunch of questions. I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but I did want to make a closing statement before we sign off, and I directed it privately to Neil, thanking him for a very nice presentation on two very diverse approaches and practices that are going to help the Finger Lakes over the long haul. And by the way, Neil, I'm an ex-OBG person, but out of Pennsylvania. And
Oh, good.
During Terry Brown's tenure, and I remember some of your, my rare occasions to headquarters at the atrium, remember hearing some of your talks on subjects other than HABs and BMPs.
Ed, most people at O'Brien and Gear that I run into, what they usually say is, "Oh, you're the guy that started Murphy brakes."
Yes, how true.
Dana, I think James Tift has a question.
Yeah. What is the feasible area of treatment for the current technologies for the HABs? I mean, how much of an area can you really treat? Are we talking about acres?
Well, using a pontoon boat with something on the pontoon boat, I mean, and Jim, this is just a guess, but I would say in a day, you might be able to treat a couple of acres.
Wow. Okay. That's good. That's what you need.
But you may also have to repeat it. Repeat it depending upon the technology it's being used.
Okay. Now, are there measurements of the toxins after you've treated?
Yes, in all of the studies that I'm aware of, certainly in DEC's overview of what Clarkson was doing and what we were doing, we had to measure microcystin LR.
Right.
And they were interested in the degradation of the microcystin as well as the degradation of the cyanobacteria itself.
Right.
Now you have a step where you start breaking down the cyanobacteria, but then you start lysing the microcystin. And if you don't keep that treatment up for a sufficient length of time, you may, in essence, tackle the cyanobacteria, but not address the microcystin issue.
What's the time frame of that?
I wish I had an answer to that.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is Ed again. So I scrolled back and I did have a BMP question that I'd like to pose to Neil. There was talk
Sure.
about the 5 foot wide riparian buffer.
Yeah.
So I had asked in the chat box if you were to go with something simpler, like a grass filter buffer, what would be the equivalent length to get the same effect on sediment?
It would have to be wider.
Yeah,
but
no doubt.
I can't tell you how much wider it would have to be. The riparian buffers that we were using were mixed grasses, shrubs, trees inserted, so it's what I would call a complex riparian buffer.
Yeah, a mix of things, including grass.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I thought then someone talked about 35 feet. So I thought maybe coincidentally would that be something like the magic number if it was grass only?
I wish I had an answer on that. I would think if you had 35 feet of just grass, it would serve as a riparian, as a pretty good riparian buffer.
Yeah.
But you do a lot.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
Neil, to be clear, when we talk about grass, are we talking about turf grass or are we talking about other types of grasses?
Frankly, with the buffers that we put in place, we use naturally occurring grasses.
Yeah.
Where it was deplete of naturally occurring grasses, we were putting in some grass seed, but fundamentally over 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, the natural grasses took over.
Neil, does the barley straw neutralize the toxin, or what is the purpose of the barley straw?
It's really, and I wish I had better, I'll give you the best I can on that. The barley straw has an extract that I think is a complex phenol molecule. In that barley straw, that phenol molecule apparently is adverse to the cyanobacteria, but I don't think it has the oxidizing capacity to really tackle the microsystem very well.
Okay.
But I haven't seen any literature on it that would support that. It's just a guess.
So there wouldn't be any reason to use the barley straw with the hydrodynamic cavitation. That doesn't make sense then.
Probably wouldn't.
No. Okay.
But you know, in an early breakout of a cyanobacteria, the barley straw extract might be very effective at stopping it before it got really going.
Okay.
Okay.
Me?
One more question. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I just want to say I'm so glad I'm on tonight. This has been really interesting presentation, and I'm a former Stumpy graduate, so it's an honor to be here with you. And I took lots of classes with Peter Black, and one of the best. It's been a long time, so a lot of this is stuff that is way over my head. But
I don't think so. I don't think so.
I was really excited to hear about the fire lane collaborations with the property owners and I was wondering what kind of thing is happening right now within the watershed with our lake owners around that. Do we have anything going on like that right now? And then just a couple real quick, 2 other comments. I'm going to look into the buffer width and really try to get a better understanding of that. And I can feed that information back through to you guys. And then the final thing I'll say is I definitely would love to do a farm tour with Partnership for Healthy Watershed. This is something that I've wanted to do for a long time. I don't know how it would work during COVID, but count me in. If there's a movement to do that, I would help to plan it and be part of it. So thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. You know, I've been a very vocal in my suggestion that we have to make this a partnership between agriculture and the people who have passion for the lake. It can't be a negative relationship. It has to be positive. People on the lake need to do some things. Agriculture needs to do some things, and they can be very symbiotic.
Okay. If it's okay with everyone then, thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you.
Excellent presentation.
Jim, thank you.
Honored to have you talking with us.
You give me excessive praise there. It's not warranted.
Thank you, Neil. This has been very helpful.
Thanks.
Paul, thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Good night.
Take care, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Neil. Good night, Frank.